There is a particular kind of person, and if you are honest with yourself, you might recognize them immediately, who has 17 notebooks. Not because they write a lot, but because they buy a new notebook every time they feel the urge to start over. The old notebooks are not finished. They are full of plans, color-coded plans, plans with sub-plans, plans that have arrows connecting them to other plans, and none of those plans have been executed. Not really, not fully. The notebooks sit on a shelf and they feel to their owner like evidence of productivity, but they are not productivity. They are the elaborate architecture of avoidance. This is what we need to talk about today. Not the practical tactics of getting things done. There are 1,000 books on that, and you have probably read several of them and highlighted them, and maybe even created a system based on them that you followed for about 2 weeks before abandoning it. What we need to talk about is the psychology underneath, the emotional machinery that keeps intelligent, capable, well-intentioned people perpetually in the planning phase. Because planning feels like doing. That is the central illusion, and understanding why the brain produces this illusion is the first step toward actually dismantling it. Let us start with what planning actually does to your nervous system. When you sit down and write out a plan, a real, detailed, beautiful plan, your brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter that fires when you achieve something. This is not a metaphor or a loose analogy. It is literal neurochemistry. The act of imagining a future in which you have done the thing produces a reward signal that is neurologically similar to the reward signal produced by having done the thing. Your brain, in a very real sense, cannot tell the difference between planning to run a marathon and running one. You get the dopamine hit either way. And so the natural human tendency is to keep doing the thing that gets you the reward with the least amount of pain. Planning is low pain. Doing is high pain. The math, from your brain's perspective, is obvious, but it goes deeper than dopamine. There is something else happening inside the planning loop that is worth examining carefully. When you are planning, you exist in a world of pure possibility. The business is not yet started, so it cannot yet fail. The book is not yet written, so no one can yet reject it. The relationship is not yet pursued, so you cannot yet be hurt. Planning is the only zone in human experience where you get to have the thing without risking the thing. You can have a successful business in your notebook that will never have to face the judgment of the market. You can write a brilliant book in your imagination that never has to face an editor, and so people stay in that zone. Not because they are lazy. Laziness is actually a very different psychological phenomenon, but because they are afraid. They are afraid of what execution will reveal about them. This is the part that most productivity advice completely misses. It treats planning addiction as an organizational problem. Just use the right system. Just break it into smaller steps. Just find an accountability partner. And those things can help at the margin, but they do not address the real question, which is, what does this person believe will happen if they actually try? Because underneath most chronic planning behavior is a belief, usually unconscious, rarely examined, that trying and failing would be more devastating than not trying at all. If you plan forever and never execute, you can maintain the story that you are someone who could do this thing. The moment you execute and fall short, you lose the story. And for many people, the story is everything. The story is their identity. The story is how they explain themselves to themselves. There is a concept in psychology called identity-based self-protection, and it describes this dynamic very precisely. We all have a narrative about who we are. Part of that narrative, for many high-achieving or intellectually ambitious people, is that they are someone with great potential. Potential is a very comfortable place to live. Potential is unfalsifiable. You can have enormous potential for decades, and no one can prove you wrong because you simply have not yet done the thing. But the moment you step into execution, potential becomes performance, and performance can be measured. Performance can be judged. Performance can fall short of what you believed potential promised. And so the person with great potential, the person who is widely regarded as brilliant, as capable, as having so many ideas, often has the strongest incentive to stay in planning mode because they have the most to lose from the falsification of their potential. You see this in academic environments quite often. The graduate student who is working on their dissertation for 8 years, not because the research is that complex, but because filing the dissertation means becoming a person who has a PhD, and a person who has a PhD can then be judged on what they do with it. As long as the dissertation is in progress, they are still someone with potential. The research is still unfolding. The big contribution is still coming. Filing means the clock starts. And for many people, starting the clock is the most terrifying thing they can imagine. Now I want to introduce another layer here, because it is not just about fear of failure. There is also a very specific kind of perfectionism at work in the chronic planner's psychology. And this perfectionism is not the kind that is about attention to detail or high standards in execution. It is a perfectionism that lives entirely in the imagination. It is the perfectionism of the ideal version. When you are planning, you are always planning the ideal version of the thing. The business plan in the notebook is the perfect business. It accounts for everything, it is elegant, it is well conceived, it is the thing at its best. The moment you begin to execute, the thing becomes real. And real things are always imperfect. Real things encounter friction and obstacles, and the gap between what you imagined and what is actually possible. And for the perfectionist planner, that gap is unbearable. Not because they cannot tolerate imperfection in the abstract. They might be quite accepting of other people's imperfect work. But because imperfection in their own execution feels like a revelation of something shameful. It feels like proof that they were not as capable as the planning suggested. There is also what I would call the planning as identity trap. For some people, being someone who plans, who thinks carefully, who considers all the angles, who does the research, has become so central to how they see themselves and how others see them that execution would actually threaten the identity. The person who has spent 5 years researching a business idea is now regarded by their family and friends as the thoughtful one, the careful one, the one who does things right. If they launch the business and it is messy and imperfect and fails quickly, they lose that social identity. But as long as they are still planning, they keep it. They are still the thorough, thoughtful person. Execution is risky for reasons that go far beyond the outcome of the thing itself. Let me talk about something called the Zeigarnik effect, because it is relevant here in a way that is a little counterintuitive. Bluma Zeigarnik was a Soviet psychologist who in the 1920s observed that waiters had much better memory for uncompleted orders than completed ones. The brain, it turns out, maintains an active tension around unfinished tasks. It keeps them in a kind of cognitive loop, returning to them, reminding you of them, generating a low-level anxiety until they are resolved. Now you might think that this would push people toward completion, that the anxiety of the unfinished task would motivate execution, and sometimes it does. But what researchers have found is that for many people, the Zeigarnik loop can be temporarily satisfied not by completing the task, but by planning to complete it. Writing a detailed plan creates the subjective feeling of progress. The brain registers forward movement, the tension eases slightly, and so the person plans feels a little better, and the urgency to actually execute diminishes, until the next wave of anxiety hits and they plan again. It becomes a loop, a self-sustaining cycle of planning as stress regulation. And this connects to something important about the role of emotion in procrastination and planning avoidance. For a very long time, really up until about the last decade of research, procrastination was understood as a time management problem. People procrastinate because they cannot organize their time effectively, but the research has moved strongly away from that view. What we now understand is that procrastination is almost entirely an emotion regulation strategy. People do not delay because they do not know what to do. They delay because doing generates uncomfortable feelings, anxiety, self-doubt, boredom, frustration, the anticipatory dread of potential failure, and avoidance makes those feelings go away. Planning is just a particularly sophisticated and socially acceptable form of avoidance. You do not look like someone who is avoiding. You look like someone who is being thorough. This is why the person caught in the planning loop often has genuine contempt for people they perceive as impulsive. They see someone who launches quickly, makes mistakes, iterates, and succeeds, and they think that person is reckless. That person is not thinking carefully. And that contempt is doing psychological work. It is constructing a value system in which the planner's behavior, the endless research, the detailed frameworks, the refusal to move until conditions are perfect, is virtuous. It is not avoidance. It is wisdom. And as long as that value system holds, the planner can feel good about not executing. They are protecting their standards. They are refusing to do something poorly. They are waiting for the right moment. The right moment, of course, never arrives. And this is a pattern so common it has become almost cliched, and yet understanding why the right moment never arrives is important. It never arrives because the conditions for execution are never constructed by planning alone. They are constructed by beginning. The information you need to take the next step is almost never available to you in the planning phase. It becomes available only once you start moving. The market research that would give you certainty does not exist until you put something in front of actual customers. The confidence you are waiting for does not precede action. It follows action. The clarity you want about whether this is the right path does not come from more analysis. It comes from walking down the path and noticing what happens. But the planner has built their entire psychology around the idea that enough preparation will eventually produce sufficient certainty to justify beginning. And that is simply not how certainty works. Certainty is retrospective. You are certain that you made the right choice only after you have lived with the consequences of the choice. Before that, there is only probability and faith and the willingness to move without guarantees. I want to say something here that might be uncomfortable. There is often a kind of intelligence that is particularly vulnerable to the planning trap. It is the intelligence that is good at seeing complexity, at identifying what could go wrong, at noticing the 17 ways that a plan could fail. This is genuinely valuable intelligence. It is the intelligence that makes good risk assessors, good lawyers, good editors. But when it is turned against one's own projects, it becomes paralyzing. Because every idea scrutinized closely enough has a fatal flaw. Every plan examined thoroughly enough has a gap, and the very intelligence that should help you navigate complexity instead becomes the mechanism by which you justify infinite delay. You are not stuck because you are not smart enough. You are stuck because you are too good at generating reasons why you are not ready yet. There is a version of this that manifests as what researchers call analysis paralysis, but I want to distinguish between two types of people who end up there. The first type genuinely does not know which option to choose, and the paralysis comes from insufficient information or genuinely balanced trade-offs. This is a real phenomenon, but it is relatively rare in the cases I am describing. The second type, and this is much more common, knows roughly what they should do. They have known for months or years. The analysis is not in service of making a better decision. The analysis is in service of delaying the decision. And somewhere, in a quiet part of themselves, they know this. But knowing it does not break the pattern, because the fear underneath the pattern has not been addressed. You can intellectually understand that you are using analysis to avoid action and still continue to do it, because understanding is not the same as the emotional work of confronting what you are actually afraid of. Let us talk about that fear more directly now, because naming it in general terms, fear of failure, fear of judgment, is not quite specific enough to be useful. What specifically are people afraid of when they will not execute? In my observation, it usually falls into one of a few categories. The first is what I would call the revelation of inadequacy. The fear that beginning will reveal that you are not as good as you hoped, that the gap between your vision and your capacity is larger than you can bear to discover. This fear is often strongest in people who have built their self-worth substantially on their intellectual or creative identity. If you are the smart one, the talented one, the one with all the ideas, then discovering through execution that the ideas are harder to realize than they seemed is a direct attack on the identity. It does not just mean the project failed. It means something about who you are. The second fear is what I would call the loss of the dream. There is something precious about an unexecuted plan. It contains the pure version of the thing. Once you begin, the thing becomes real, and real means imperfect, and imperfect means the pure version is gone forever. Some people, honestly, prefer to keep the dream. The dream of the novel they will write someday is more comforting than the reality of the novel they are writing, which is hard and messy and not as good as they imagined. And I say this without judgment, because this is a genuinely human response to the gap between imagination and reality. But it is important to name it, because the person caught in this pattern is often telling themselves a story about waiting for the right time, about not being ready, about needing more preparation. And the real story is simply that they find the dream more livable than the execution. The third fear is the fear of completion. This one is slightly different and less often discussed. Some people avoid execution not because they fear failing, but because they fear succeeding. And then what? Completing the thing means defining yourself as someone who does that thing, and doing that thing for the first time means doing it again. and the pressure of iteration and maintenance, and the weight of being someone who has done this thing that can feel heavier than the freedom of being someone who is about to. There is a whole psychology around what happens to people after major achievements that is relevant here. Many people experience a significant crash after completing something large. Not because it went badly, but because the identity organizing project of working toward it is suddenly gone. And some people, having experienced this or having intuited it, prefer to stay permanently in the working toward phase. So what actually moves people out of this pattern? Because I do not want to just describe the trap and leave you in it. The answer is not, as I said earlier, simply better planning tools or tighter systems. Those can help, but they are not addressing the root. What actually shifts things, in my observation and in the research, is usually a combination of a few things. The first is what I would call honest naming, actually saying out loud, at least to yourself, that you are avoiding. Not because you are not ready, but because beginning feels threatening in a specific way that you can describe. This sounds simple, but it is actually quite hard, because the planning loop has very good defenses. It has a story for why this is not avoidance, why this is thoroughness, why this is wisdom. Piercing that story requires a kind of ruthless honesty that most people only achieve after the cost of not executing becomes higher than the cost of risking failure. The second thing that moves people is what researchers call implementation intentions, and the research on this is remarkably robust. An implementation intention is not a plan in the general sense. It is a very specific statement of the form. When situation X arises, I will do behavior Y. Not, I will work on the project this week, but at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, when I am sitting at my desk and have closed my email, I will open the document and write the first sentence. The specificity does something important. It removes the decision. The decision has already been made. There is no room for the planning loop to spin up and suggest more preparation. The moment arrives and the behavior follows almost automatically because it has been pre-committed to in detail. The third thing, and this might be the most important, is a direct encounter with the fear. Not bypassing it, not managing around it. Actually sitting with the question, what is the worst version of what I am afraid of, and could I survive it? Could I survive publishing this thing and having people think it is mediocre? Could I survive launching this business and having it fail within a year? Could I survive beginning and discovering that I am less talented in this area than I hoped? For most people, when they actually engage with those questions honestly, rather than fleeing into planning to avoid them, the answer is yes. The feared outcome is painful. It is genuinely painful, but it is survivable. And the recognition that you can survive the worst version of the thing you fear is often enough to loosen the grip of the avoidance, not eliminate it. The fear will still be there when you sit down to begin, but you can act in the presence of fear. You do not need the fear to disappear first. You do not need to feel confident. Confidence is what the planning loop is waiting for, and the planning loop will wait forever. You need to be willing to move while still uncertain, still afraid, still not sure it is going to work. Because here's the thing about execution that planning can never capture. Once you begin, the information environment changes completely. You start receiving real feedback from the real world. And that feedback, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it tells you that you were wrong about something, is the most valuable thing that exists for the development of anything real. The plan in the notebook is responding to imagined feedback. It is a conversation with yourself about what you think will happen. Execution is a conversation with reality about what is actually happening, and reality is always smarter than the plan. Reality will show you things the plan could not have anticipated. It will close off some paths and open others that were invisible from inside the planning phase. The person who executes, even imperfectly, even messily, even with a plan that turns out to be wrong in several important ways, is accumulating real knowledge. The person who plans is accumulating only imagined knowledge. And imagined knowledge, no matter how detailed the notebook, does not compound the way real knowledge does. The last thing I want to say is this. The planning loop is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of weakness or laziness or a lack of will. It is a very rational response to a real psychological problem. The brain is trying to protect you from pain. It has found a strategy that gets you the reward of feeling productive without the risk of the judgment that comes from putting real work into the world. That is a sensible thing for a brain to do. The goal is not to shame the behavior. The goal is to understand it clearly enough that you can make a different choice, and the different choice is not a grand declaration of courage. It is not a radical transformation. It is just a small beginning. One actual step, taken imperfectly, in the direction of the thing you've been planning for too long. Not because the plan is complete, not because the moment is right, not because the fear is gone, but because the cost of permanent preparation is higher than you have been willing to admit. And because whatever is on the other side of beginning, even if it is harder than you hoped, is real. And real is the only place where anything that matters actually happens.